Welcome to Conscious Conversations. My name's Luke McLean. I host this cool little boutique podcast that catches up with people who are living really conscious, authentic and purposeful lives. So what we do is we sit down with them and we pull apart their story, their journey, their life. And what we look at is the tools and the resources and the beliefs that they've cultivated to live really authentically, to become successful that way. And, we dig into what they've learned and how they've grown as people. And what I try to do is extract some of the best information off that journey and give it to you in a podcast. So that's what this is. I get some really great guests around wellness, leadership, nutrition, all types of things. Whatever anybody's doing that's really authentic to them, that they love, that I can talk to and learn from, I want to know about it. So that's what this podcast is. So I hope you like that. This week's no exception. It's a really good friend of mine and someone that I look up to in the wellness space, Mark Bunn. Mark's, a best-selling author of a book called Ancient Wisdom. Ancient Wisdom is based on natural living from the Ayurvedic principles, which he studied in depth in Southeast Asia and for many years. And what he did is he put all these awesome principles and laid them into how we live in Western life and gave us really practical tips on how to live better. And it's just the simple stuff done really well, which is what life is anyway. So that book is awesome. He's a public speaker and he regularly is talking to groups and big businesses around leadership, energy, wellness, and just how to live a higher quality of life in a simpler way, which we get into that in this conversation. We really talk about our need to live simpler, to live better, to be more, not to do more. So that's what the essence or the heart of this conversation is today with Mark. So that's cool. If you want to know a bit about me, you can hit me up at ecolifecoaching.net or Luke McLean Mindfulness on Instagram. They're probably the two that I'm working the most at the moment. I'm a life coach who I work with teams and individuals. I'm also a meditation teacher. So that's what I do, and that's where my passion sits, and that's what I'm really trying to work towards is raising the consciousness around wellness and around mindfulness. So Mark Bunn, ripping bloke, ripping podcast. So I hope you like it, Mark Bunn. You've been waiting around long enough. The moment is here and you better stand up. It's time. You better stand up. It's time. You better stand up. It's time. You better stand up. I'd love to kick off firstly with the footy, because I think that was the starting point, and the research and what I've sort of done was that you were exploring different ways of living whilst playing footy, but at that time, especially in the AFL, it wasn't normal. There wasn't a lot of mindfulness coaching. There wasn't that type of performance-based mentality. So how was that for you, at Fitzroy and Hawthorn? When I reading your book, and I think it was talking to you as well, how you're nasal breathing while training's on, and basically back then nasal breathing wasn't a thing for performance in those days. It was having a beer and a pie after a game.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. I start to think of it now and look back, and nasal breathing was probably one of the more reasonable things I was doing. I still remember it. Yeah, 19, I was. Back in those days, it was usually Pat Benatar and rock and roll before a game to sort of motivate you, and you could hear players out in the change rooms, smacking balls into the walls and firing up, and I'd be sneaking out into the toilet and meditating and doing sun salutes for my warm-ups and doing nasal breathing in 400-metre sprints in pre-season. So, looking back, I was probably a bit of a weirdo, but I think the basis of it was just always a desire to get the best out of myself, and probably, and I say this now in corporate talks, that probably the fact that I wasn't a natural, brilliant footballer at that level was a good thing, because it made me really look for all the different advantages I could get, or the little angles I could sort of do to sort of maximise my performance and be as sort of durable as I could be. Whereas if you were just a brilliant player like an Ablett or a Darren Jarman, you sort of just could coast through and you didn't have to worry too much about that. So that's where it came from, and it got me used to sort of being a little bit left field and a little bit different to what other people do, which I think is also a good thing when it comes to health and well-being. You know, if we do what everyone else does, we're probably on the wrong track.
Absolutely. So, Mark, like from that, just a couple of questions. Was that exploration for performance really just central around football, or was that for you then already as a teenager around life performance, or was it more just to get the most out of your football at that stage?
Initially, it was just football. I always remember just as a kid, you know, my life was it. You know, football was everything I wanted to do. I wasn't even that much into girls when I was a teenager. It was football. So yeah, initially that was the drive to sort of maximise the whole AFL side of things, but pretty quickly after it, and particularly once the meditation started, that sort of, I always explain that it's just broadening my whole worldview. I started to see life rather than just football and girls and nightclubs to something more bigger and comprehensive. And so that from there it started to broaden, and I started to transition into the whole sort of life performance and just health generally from there.
Okay. And for you to have that self-awareness even back as a kid playing football or as in, you know, early 20s, what were your unlocks before that? Like, what were you reading, and how did you get introduced to it? Especially if football was sort of you growing up, there must have been a period or a moment in time where you read or discovered something that unlocked you into that space.
Yeah, great question. And it was actually my mother I trace it back to. I still remember as a 16-year-old, she was very much into the positive mind. You know, there's a lot of books around in those days. Wayne Dyer was quite famous, and he wrote a book, You'll see it when you believe it, you know, rather than, you know, the other way around. It was all around this sort of positive manifestation and the mind. So it got me very interested in the power of the mind, even at 16. So I started to read a lot of books and tried sort of different meditations, and it sort of just spread from there. So yeah, my dear old mother, I would credit for sort of the initial impulse to look particularly to the mind and away from just the physical.
And were you aware then, that your mother obviously had this broader lens than most mothers would have back growing up? And then were you aware of the scope of training you were getting outside of football, or what you'd be getting at school that other kids just were not aware of, even today, of that type of learning?
At the time, I wasn't. I think when you're a kid, your worldview is quite narrow. You know, you don't see much outside of your own family and sort of your close network of friends and sort of football mates. But as I've gone through life and I now look back, I can see that, it was a fairly fortunate that I did have a mother who did see life that way and introduced me to those sort of concepts. So because it was, even today, you know, we're still in the transition of understanding the whole mind-body connection and the power of the mind. So obviously 25 years ago, it was in the very early days. So but it was good.
And did you see, you obviously would have seen, there would have been a slight separation of, because you were in that footy environment and in that high-performing footy environment, and then there's this meditation, holistic wellness side of you. So you're at polar opposites, and potentially within hours in a completely different environment of, you know, the boys' club to potentially sitting down for a meditation. What's that transition for a young guy like?
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that in obviously the prelude to the call today, and the thing for me was basically to cover it all up. You know, as you know, I wasn't a superstar at the football club, so I was sort of there, you know, trying to make a name and, you know, try and play in the seniors. So I certainly wasn't out there promoting the fact I was, you know, sort of this bit left ball and bit of an oddball. So so I would just keep it to myself. So I learnt TM, Transcendental Meditation, the day of my third senior AFL game. So really early on in the piece. But I'd just do it at home. I'd do it, as I said, sneak off to the change rooms in the toilet, and no one knew about it during my career really. And the same with a lot of the other stuff. The nasal breathing is a little bit more obvious, so that sort of came up in conversations, and various players that have a bit of a laugh and ask me what the hell I was doing, and they'd try it out for a while. But so I sort of got used to just keeping it to myself. I wasn't trying to be confrontational or to sort of advertise my strangeness too much.
Right. And how were the players? Were they receptive? Were they didn't? Was it sort of they just let it go, or how was it taken? And were there any players that were more interested than others that you formed a relationship throughout the time?
There was a couple at Hawthorn that I think Richard Taylor, who went on to play with West Coast as well, he was quite interested, and he's since become a physiotherapist. So obviously he's in the sort of natural health sort of line of things. But sort of more the old school guys didn't sort of see it the same way. I still remember running 400-metre sprints at Hawthorn in pre-season, and you'd have handicaps. So the slower players would sort of start 40, 50 metres ahead, and the faster ones would be down the back. And so we'd cruise past guys like Dunstall, who could, had a bit of a busted nose anyway, could hardly breathe through it, even if he wanted to. You'd get a few swear words and a few profanities being thrown your way as you cruised past, breathing through your nose.
Doing it sort of half pace, mate.
Yeah, that's right.
I love it.
So,
and actually, so the footy finishes up, and I said in a podcast last week that football for most people, and professional sport in general, it's potentially 7 to 8% of your life. It's a short window in actually what you get out of your life, but it can be quite profound. And for some players, they come out the other side of professional sport really well, and some really struggle to sort of reintroduce themselves back in because they've had a pretty different and some might say easier life with financials, especially today, and find it hard to get back into normal society. So how did you introduce yourself? What was the next steps beyond, AFL and moving into sort of natural health?
Yeah. Well, again, I guess I was lucky, and I think it's probably beneficial when you're not a superstar. And if you actually look, you look at the Gary Ablett seniors, the Careys, a lot of our very, very top players that have this sort of built up, in some ways, sort of artificial sense of self, they put on the pedestal, and post-career, it's a very big fall down. They often don't do so well. So the fact that I was just, I often say fill up the numbers for a few years. I always knew that football's never going to be all of my life, so I could sort of transition a lot easier. So even before I finished, I was already doing a Bachelor of Applied Science, so human movement, sort of Western science, and informally studying a lot of the sort of Eastern sciences, Ayurvedic medicine, all that sort of thing. So I already had a bit of an eye on the transition. And then basically as soon as I finished football, I went to Southeast Asia working for an aid group and got sort of introduced to Ayurveda in a real life practical sense, and just took it from there. Just sort of opened my eyes to a whole new world, and something that really fascinated me in terms of life skills and health skills, and it was made the transition a lot easier.
Cool. And mate, can you park it there for a second? What's that trip like? Like the trip to Southeast Asia, from reading about this type of thing on, in books to actually going and experiencing it firsthand. What's that transition like for you, or what's the impact?
Well, it's huge. And I think probably a story to illustrate the power is best. And I remember I was in Cambodia, so a very poor country. And one day we went out, there was a local, what they call a Vaidya, which is an Ayurvedic doctor. He was Indian, and he was volunteering his time there also. And what they do is we take him out on a little motorbike about an hour or 2 hours out of the local town, so it was very, very remote. And we were sitting in this little room. I was sitting